Oh, and it's recording. Great. Thank you for doing that. My name is Veronica Ariano Douglas. I will be moderating the mid-conference keynote. Welcome. We're so glad that you're here and hope that you're having a really fabulous conference experience. I know I've gone to some amazing sessions already. So before we begin, we want to let you know, as you saw earlier, that this keynote session will be recorded. So if you have any colleagues or folks who weren't able to attend the keynote today, they'll be able to watch later on. We definitely wanted to share some updates with you mid-conference. We are super excited to note that $5,708 has been raised for the Indian Land Tenure Foundation so far, which is really wonderful. We certainly want to remind you to donate if you are able to do so, and it goes to the Beyond the Land Acknowledgement Fund. So thank you. Second thing is that tomorrow there has been a session cancellation. So that is the session at 3:45 Eastern Time, and it's the Coaching Employee Performance Towards Success, Not Termination session. Right, and with that, we want to welcome our mid-conference keynote. We're all really excited to welcome Fobazi Ettarh. Her research is concerned with the relationships and tensions between the espoused values of librarianship and the realities present in the experiences of marginalized librarians and library users. In 2018, she coined the term and defined the concept of vocational awe, which describes the set of values, ideas, and assumptions librarians have about themselves and the profession that results in beliefs that libraries as institutions are inherently good and sacred and therefore beyond critique. In her article, Vocational Awe, The Lies We Tell Ourselves, she describes how vocational awe can lead to burnout and a sense that one's own self-care is less important than the work being done. Fobazi's critical work on libraries, labor, and identity has been published in the Library with the Lead Pipe and edited collections, including the Critical Library Pedagogy Handbook and Knowledge Justice, Disrupting Library and Information Studies Through Critical Race Theory. She has given invited talks at numerous professional and scholarly conferences and events, including the Library as Place Symposium and keynotes at the Association of College and Research Libraries and Library Journals Director Summit. And for those of you who may have seen it, she was also most recently cited on Monday in an opinion piece in the New York Times, which is amazing. Congratulations. Her research has been covered in numerous outlets, and she consults in library and corporate contexts on labor, identity, and diversity. She is also the creator of the open access video game, Killing Me Softly, a game about microaggressions. So with all of that said, I want to welcome Fobazi. Thank you so much for being here with us, and I will pass things over to you.
All right, hello everyone, and good afternoon. I will be sharing my screen now. So, okay. Thank you, Calm, for inviting me. And let's see. are my notes showing, or is it just the presentation? If someone could let me know.
Yeah, the notes are showing right now.
Okay.
You can share screen just the presentation window.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. Let me try this again. Okay. Well, about now. Is
Okay,
it
that's great.
okay? Great. So, again, my keynote is talking about the fact that we are 3 years right into this pandemic and what that means for both managers and workers. So again, hello everyone, my name is Fobazi Ettarh. You can find me at Twitter. It's where I'm most often, despite everything with its new person. Please feel free to @ me and follow me and use it during the presentation. If you'd like to quote me, everything is fine. I know the conference hashtag is libcalm, I'm pretty sure, but I'm sure Veronica or someone else will put the hashtag in the chat just in case. For longer form pieces from me, you can go to my website. My website is also where you can find me for consultation for your library or EDI audits, whatever it might be. And finally, last but not least, right? There's always email. I will say that I tend to be slowest in responding to email, but I do always try and respond. And it is summer session, so I am more likely to respond. It's usually during the academic year where it can be a little tricky in terms of reaching me. But yes, again, thank you, everyone. And as I said, please feel free to reach out if you have any questions or comments, both during this and afterward. Okay, so before we begin, I always like to try and have this preface, right? Vocational awe is a large part of librarianship. And because of that, when we talk about deconstructing it, it can get a little uncomfortable. There's a reason it's called growing pains, right? The act of growing is not always the most comfortable thing. I would ask that you, however, embrace that discomfort because again, it shows that we're growing in some way. And I would never again tell you not to feel any sort of feelings, all those feelings that you might have of defensiveness or guilt or whatever it might be, they're completely valid. All I would ask is that you try and think about ways to turn that into something more useful, some sort of action. For example, right, if something like job creep makes you super uncomfortable, thinking about how we can model better boundaries would be a way to turn that into an action item. And so, again, feelings are great, right? But hopefully, as we go through this, we'll turn those feelings into actions. And so here's what I will be talking about today. Number one, right? What is the story of libraries? What have been the dominant narrative? What do we think of when we think about libraries? Moving on to vocation, right? Is librarianship an occupation or a vocation? While they might seem like the same word, they do have very different meanings. Moving on to part three, what does this mean? How does vocational awe play out in the workplace? And finally, shifting the paradigm, knowing what we know now, how can we move forward? Okay. So, what is the story of libraries? What is the dominant narrative? So here are some of the quotes that people outside of libraries mention when they talk about libraries. When a library is open, right, no matter its size, democracy is open too. I see the library as a temple. Without libraries, we have no past, no future. Right, as you can see, libraries are very well thought of outside of the field by various intellectuals, writers, poets, and so on. And here are some of the quotes that within libraries, what we talk about, right? Libraries are for everyone. Libraries are America's most democratic institutions. They inspire community healing and understanding, so on and so forth. All right, so again, libraries are very well thought of, both outside and within the field. All right, and so it wouldn't be, right, considered a vocation if we didn't have library heroes. And so here are some of the examples of the heroes that we consider within libraries, right? There's John Cotton Dana. He was a librarian and museum director in Newark, New Jersey. And he is best known as the name of the John Cotton Dana Award, which are given to libraries with really amazing public outreach and communications. John Cotton Dana also, throughout his 40-year span, created the Special Libraries Association. And so there is an award in SLA for those with lifetime achievement within the library field. Another major, I guess, hero endowment, whatever you would like to call it, right, is Library Journal's Mover and Shaker Award. They started in the early 2000s, and its goal was to demonstrate and uplift library workers and those in library adjacent fields who are an inspiration to other people within the field, right? And so it is awarded to librarians and non-degreed library workers, publishers, vendors, reviewers, and so on, who impact the library field and model so-and-so good librarianship for others. I'm sure we've probably seen a quote like this before or something similar to it, right? Choose a job you love and you'll never have to work a day in your life. The idea is that by doing a profession or a career that you love, because you love it, it won't feel like work, and therefore you'll be able to give it your all, put your 120% into it. What happens though is, right, talking about the commonalities between the do what you love narrative and what we think about when we talk about libraries, is that there is this association with religion or spirituality. There is most definitely a good conflation between the actual work and the workers, right? You might find that we often talk about the library did this, or the library helped its community in this way, right? And when we say it that way, it conflates the library as a building with the library as the workers who actually do the work within those buildings. And by that conflation, it can make it that much harder to recognize just how much labor is involved in doing all of these amazing things that the patrons and the communities praise us for. Another commonality, right, is this idea that we as a field are the only democratic institution left, the last democratic institution left, and therefore we stand in as democracy itself. While we are in many ways a democratic institution, by saying that we stand in as democracy, we brush under the rug many of the ways that we aren't a democratic institution, many of the ways that we don't, in fact, listen to our workers, our colleagues, our patrons within the institution of librarianship. And finally, this idea that we run on love and passion, right? The idea that we are doing what we love. Not only does that, again, erase the amount of labor that is involved in doing this job we love, but it erases all of the complicated feelings that people might have about their job, right? By creating a metric around love and passion and tying that to efficacy, it forces those who might have ambivalent feelings about librarianship or apathetic feelings or anything that's not incredibly positive to be seen as somehow less effective, less involved, whatever words you might use in librarianship. And also make it so that those who can't give 120%, their 24/7 lifestyle for libraries, as those who are, again, less passionate or less able to be a good librarian. And so, right, what does it mean when we say a vocation, right? Is librarianship an occupation or a vocation? So as I mentioned, while these two words, occupation and vocation, might seem like the same thing, right? Same denotation, they have very different connotations. An occupation is a job or a career that you put into your professional life, whereas a vocation is a strong inclination towards a state of being or a work right? It's in its earliest definitions, it was literally defined as the ways in which you responded to God's call, right? And so it's very much still tied to that religiosity. I'm a pastor's kid. Shout out to any PKs in the audience. There's usually at least one or two. So as our fellow PKs might know, right? While you may leave church, the building, right? Church is always a 24/7 lifestyle, right? There's Sunday school, there's Bible study during the week, there's women's retreats, men's retreats, there's even vacation Bible school during the summers, right? While you may leave church, church never really leaves you, right? And so again, thinking about all of these things, when we think about our own relationship to libraries or the relationship that we see talked about libraries, whether it be those, again, outside of libraries or those within the field itself, right? Is it an occupation or a vocation, right? As you might imagine, right, libraries and librarianship is very much treated as a vocation, right? Looking at this quote by Michael Crichton, civilized nations build libraries. Lands that have lost their souls close them down. And so I would like everyone to think about the beginning of the pandemic for a minute. I know it might seem like another lifetime ago, but try and think back to the spring and summer of 2020 and the conversations around whether or not our libraries were going to close or whether we were going to reduce hours, close entirely, any of those conversations that were starting to happen as we realized just how serious COVID was. Feel free to write what some of those conversations were in the chat or just reflect on it for a minute. What were some of the gut reactions to the idea that the libraries might actually have to close? What were the proponents saying of closing the library versus what were, again, further, might seem like a harsh word, but opponents of those closing the library? What were they saying? And what was the conversations around it? I'll give everyone a minute or two to either reflect or share in the chat. right, I'm seeing a lot of great sharing, right? And lots of similar things about, right, if we close, we'll never be able to reopen. How will we show our value if we're closed? How what the rest of the campus shutting down, but the library staying open until the very last minute. I was working in New Jersey at the time, and Rutgers actually extended their hours for a while, extended the library hours because of the conversation around essential services being open longer. And it actually took the governor writing an executive order saying that, no, this also includes academic libraries. You must shut down before Rutgers and other academic libraries within New Jersey to actually close. So again, not only did the conversation be we shouldn't close down, but in fact, we should stay open longer because the students and our communities will need us if everything else is shut down. And so, we were in many ways lucky that the governor was such a supporter of shutting down all of these services, because otherwise we would have been open until 9 p.m. every night, including weekends, I think was the conversation around it. And again, it took pressure from various unions and people within the library communities to be like, yes, it's true that, a lot of our students don't have access to computers outside of the library, but that if this disease is something that spreads through being in an enclosed space, closing the campus except for one building will literally force everyone into, again, the one building open and increase the danger, not just for us as the workers, but the students themselves. And so, again, if it wasn't for the pressure coming from the unions, there would be a very good chance that we would never have closed. And so it's why I try and use this quote when I talk about, right, the impact of vocational awe, the impact that just thinking about closing the library is somehow going to destroy democracy, right? If we're a stand-in for democracy, or take away our souls, like whatever the strong language is, right? It creates pressure to be open at the cost of everything else, including our own well-being. And so what is vocational awe, right? Vocational awe describes a set of ideas, values, and assumptions librarians have about themselves and the profession that result in notions that libraries as institutions are inherently good and sacred, and therefore beyond critique. And so, again, it's not necessarily saying that you shouldn't love your job or anything like that. Vocational awe is about seeing the library as an inherently good institution. And because of that, seeing the library and what anything that a library worker does as beyond critique. Right, and so if we think about it, right, libraries are inherently good. They provide access to all. They have diverse collections. They champion truth and free speech, unless, of course, they're undesirable. And so what does that mean, right? It means that those collections about people who are undesirable won't be in libraries, whether it means that we in the past have kept libraries from integrating. Many libraries actually again, talking about shutting down, they closed their doors rather than integrate. Or what they would do is that they would take the Carnegie money and they would create a small integrated reading room and only have that reading room be open very limited hours. Or they would have the reading room be open during the day, but they would take out all the chairs and tables within that room, anything to prevent long-term mixing of the races, as they said. And now, right, what we're seeing with, it's June, right, it's Pride Month, what we're seeing with LGBTQ peoples being, and materials being taken out of libraries, being soft censored, or rather, when I say soft censored, being like, we won't order library materials that have to do with queer people because we don't want to have book challenges, right? And so instead of waiting for the challenge to happen, just taking out all the materials that could potentially be challenged. And that is a form of censorship. I know that many people might not see it that way, but it is, because what you're doing is you are saying that these materials are too controversial and we don't want to have our community be uncomfortable, right? You're choosing those who are uncomfortable's feelings over those who are actually marginalized, right? The LGBT patrons, the LGBT people within the community, the LGBT workers themselves. We're saying that your feelings don't matter as much as the people who are uncomfortable with the lifestyle, right? And so, again, if we're saying we provide access to all, but we're censoring all of these materials, right? How do we say that we're doing both, right? You can't. Libraries are inherently sacred. Oftentimes when libraries are spoken of, they're seen as safe spaces, holy spaces, sanctuaries, right? Especially during major events such as COVID, such as the 2020 protests, such as Hurricane Sandy and other big environmental disasters, right? Libraries are seen as the place you go to learn what's happening in the community, get information, know that, again, whatever is happening in the sort of real world, you can be safe in the library. But again, it's for those who are privileged, for those we deem worthy. Yes, during the early 2000s and the Patriot Act, many library workers did make sure that their policies upheld patron privacy. You have the Connecticut Four, of course, famous for breaking their NDA to make sure that their patrons' records would stay private, and the sort of decades-long fight afterward, right? But again, it ignores the fact that many of our policies are unhelpful or, in fact, hostile to certain populations. Those experiencing homelessness, right, by having policies that require bank statements or government IDs, showing residency within the neighborhood, right, can be just one way that those experiencing homelessness might be excluded, or whether it's meeting room policies that allow all external groups to use their rooms, including hate groups, right? Because no library that is a safe space to hate groups and bigots can, in fact, be a safe space to all. By allowing hate groups and bigots to have programs within the library, or by using the false equivalency that if you have books about Black Lives Matter, then you also have to have books and programs about police lives mattering, right? These false equivalencies show that, one, you as an institution or an organization are saying that those two arguments are at the same level, which of course they're not, right? One is saying Black lives haven't mattered for X amount of years, and this is why. The other group is saying that, one, the police are a personal identity, which, one, it's not, right? A police officer is what you do, not whom you are, right? Once you take off the uniform, right, no one can tell necessarily, right, that you are a police officer, and therefore it cannot be compared in the same way as an identity as being Black or queer or disabled in that way. And again, by saying, well, you know, we can't have Black Lives Matter because we can't have any group where it excludes people where it's only people of color, right? Another false equivalency, because I'm sure that many groups that come in, regardless of the topic, are mostly white, if not all white, and that isn't seen as somehow exclusionary in the way that an all person of color group is seen as, right? And ultimately, the two arguments are, one, are fighting for their right to live and love and be seen as actual people, and one group is fighting for the right to erase those people, erase their rights, erase their personhoods, erase everything about them that makes them human and therefore being shunned from society, right? Those are two very different arguments. And if we are saying, again, that we provide access as a safe space, then the safe space needs to be for those who are marginalized and not those who are trying to marginalize others. And finally, right, libraries are beyond critique, right? Libraries are often seen, again, as the last bastions of democracy, the soul of the community, and yet we uphold white supremacy in multiple ways and ignore more valid critiques such as overwork and underpay and all of these other sort of labor issues. And really, a true democracy wouldn't ignore large swaths of the population in that way, wouldn't ignore critiques by saying, but look at all the good we do, right? That is not how democracy works. And so how does vocational awe affect the workplace? One of the big norms of vocational awe is the lack of work-life balance, it's work-life separation, right? The pressure to come into the library, rain, shine, sickness, whatever, right? Guilt when taking vacation days or asking for more staff to alleviate pressure. The idea that you can contact me at any time because I'm always on my email, right? I'm sure that most, if not all of us, have said or felt this pressure at one point or another, right? This is my own scholarship, and it's still hard for me not to want to answer emails at like 2 a.m. or during vacations. And so by having this pressure, again, what it does is it marginalizes those who can't put 24/7 into the library. Those with children, those who are taking care of elderly parents or elderly relatives, the disabled, and those who, just don't want to spend 24/7 thinking about the library, right? Those who actually want to have a robust personal life. And by saying that this is the norm, that you have to have this sort of self-righteousness by working all the time, all we're saying is that if you have these things that prevent you from doing that, you're not being the best librarian you can be or the best library worker you can be. Another norm, right, is the act of being a white savior, right? White savoring. Melville Dewey, actually, one of the many reasons that librarianship is a predominantly female woman field is because Melville Dewey specifically chose women to staff libraries because he believed that they would be more caring towards the patrons, and also so that he could pay women less. So again, this sort of idea that women are more caring and want to enlighten others, want to save others, is something that has been within the field of librarianship since the very beginning. And this has created a culture of trying to save everyone by being everything to everyone, right? The job creep, those other duties as assigned becoming just a bigger and more regular part of your day-to-day responsibilities, and it going from being a social worker to being an accountant to being an EMT, to basically this idea that librarianship solves all social ills. And so what does that mean in terms of us as workers, us as supervisors, right? It means that whenever something occurs, we think, how can we be a part of that? Because we have to show our value at any time and every time. And so this leads to a cycle of exploitation where you bring in a worker who's passionate and wants to save the world, and then you put them through everything, right? Low morale experiences, abuses, all of these things that we've talked about, right? Lack of work-life balance, job creep, and it just goes on and on and on until the worker burns out and either leaves the library or leaves the field entirely. And then what happens, right? The cycle starts anew. We either recruit someone to fill in that role, or perhaps worse, we don't fill in that role, and then we just shuffle those responsibilities onto everyone else who's left, therefore increasing the burden and making it more likely that burnout will happen, and the cycle continues and the cycle continues. And so again, right, this was something that was big even before the pandemic, and then the pandemic happened. And so again, take a minute or two to reflect on these 3 years of the pandemic. What did your library do when it first started? How long did it take to close, if it ever did? What were the rights for the workers, if they ever had any? When it came to reopening, were people able to still work from home? What did that depend on what status they were, librarian or staff? And when it comes to masking, like, are you able to tell patrons to mask? If not, why, right? Just think about all of these things that have happened in the past 3 years. And feel free to share in the chat if you'd like. And so as we can see, right, there's been a large sort of variety in terms of library responses, with people having some good experiences when it comes to support throughout these years, and others not so much. There's commonalities have been, faculty having more rights than the library workers in general, having no support when it comes to masking, having those policies that were actually really helpful during the sort of big mid-pandemic time with work from home and other sort of accessible policies being stripped away as COVID has stopped, right? Or now that we're living in a post-COVID society. And I could definitely say that that's something that I've experienced as well, having really amazing policies that were implemented during COVID being taken away, even though it has been shown to be so helpful, right, in regards to working from home, flexible scheduling, so on and so forth. And so when we think about the cost of our service, it's exploitation, it's abuse. And it used to be, right, that burnout would be in this third square. But now with COVID, with it still being such, again, despite what the broader society is saying, such a deadly disease, death is no longer an extreme when it talks about what librarianship does when it starts to grind you down, right? By saying that we need to put in 120%, 150% of ourselves day after day after day, week after week, year after year, right? What does it mean that burnout is now a better case scenario, right? What does it mean that, especially now that contact tracing isn't as big of a thing, now that people aren't testing as much or as thoroughly, right? COVID still is more likely to go through our communities now without any sort of acknowledgement. And what is, if any, the support that we're giving our workers who especially are in public services, who deal with our students more often, our faculty more often, our community members more often, right? What does it say that a lot of those, again, policies that helped with COVID, such as being able to use COVID-specific sick time, or being able to have more flexible scheduling, being able to work from home more in general and staying safe in that way, right? All of these things mean that death as a result of working in a library is no longer an extreme radical thing like it was perhaps 3-4 years ago when vocational awe was still more of a newer concept. Is this the kind of leadership that we want to have within our libraries? Is this the kind of management that we want to model within our libraries? You know, of course not, right? And so what can we do knowing all of this? Right, and so let's talk about shifting the paradigm, right? Knowing what we know, thinking about all that we've seen in these past 3 years and beyond, how do we move forward? How do we create a healthier, more holistic workplace? So I always try and have this quote because I think it's really important. I know that cynicism is really easy to feel these days because it just seems like nothing can ever get fixed, right? Nothing will ever move forward. There's only more horror after horror when you look at the news, right? When you see what's happening within libraries, with all the book challenges, with all the attempts to erase EDI work, CRT, or critical race theory, for those who don't know, and just anything that has to do with anyone who isn't a straight, white, conservative man, basically, right? And so while it may feel painful, you have to act as if it were possible to radically transform the world, and you have to do it all the time. I'm not saying that you won't have days where you just want to like cry and scream, like definitely do that. But as much as it like sucks, to be quite honest, right? The only alternative is to give up. And that's no real alternative at all. And so what can we do within libraries? We can start by setting boundaries. Communicate with your supervisees, your supervisors about reciprocal expectation, model good boundaries, set aside time for your life, your loved ones, your hobbies, reinforce those good boundaries, right? Especially if you are higher administration, it is up to you to make sure that you're modeling good boundaries for the workers below you, because I'm sure we all can remember management that we've had in the past who say one thing but mean something very different, right? Or who say policies, but the reinforcement of the policies differ dramatically depending on your status, depending on your seniority, whatever it might be. And I know it could definitely be hard as you move up in the chart and you get more responsibility and have more accountability to have good boundaries, but it's important not just for those working under you, but for yourself as well. Working collectively is a big one, right? You don't have to be a union to act like a union. Talk to your coworkers, talk to your supervisees, talk to your colleagues. Make a pact saying, we're going to set good boundaries. We're going to have a good work-life balance. We're going to, at the very least, within our organization, try and set standards that will help make the organizational culture more holistic, healthier. And finally, create community. Make connections with other managers outside your department, outside the university, to learn from their perspectives and to create and strengthen a community of practice. We don't all know all the answers, and that's what events like this are for, right? So learn from each other to see what we could do to help each other move forward. We're not alone, even though it may feel like it sometimes, right? Reaching out, creating that community of practice will also help with alleviating those feelings of burnout and stress. And that's it. So thank you again for listening to me, and I will take any questions now.
Thank you so much, Fobazi. Really appreciate your thoughts and insight and advice for all of us in this profession. I just want to remind folks that if you have a question, to please add that to the Q&A, and we'll go ahead and get started. Okay, so one question is, do you have any advice for how to get peers to work collectively if they are so influenced by vocational awe that they don't have good boundaries and will take on endless work for the good of the vocation?
Yeah, so I think depending on, where you are in the organizational chart, my question or the answer will be a little different. So if you are like a supervisor or you're in administration, one thing I would say is to stop rewarding those people who go like overboard in terms of, taking on the endless work for the good of the vocation. Because in many ways, people become like that because they've been in other organizations where they were rewarded for doing that, or where it became the norm to do so. And so allowing them to know that, no, like regardless of the amount of work that you do, like I will only, I'm only looking at what's in your job description or what's in, however you're defining success for this position. One, and like just keep saying that, like going above and beyond is your own prerogative, but I will only be evaluating you on X, Y, and Z. That will, over time, give them the knowledge saying like, oh, like, no, they really will not like take into account all of this extra work. And so not only does that show those who don't want to do that they don't have to, but it also shows those who continue to do that it won't, that they have no self-righteousness to hold over other workers.
Thank you so much for that response. We're going to move on to the next most upvoted question. How do you suggest that we support the folks who have more pressure on them to work on site and do not have any privilege in working from home or flexibility? I see a lot of frustration about that in the chat. And yeah, there's a whole discussion, especially about folks who work in access services where so much of their work is on site.
Yeah, I think that if you have to work on site, right, and you're worried about COVID safety, even though, again, the broader world has pretended that COVID doesn't exist, there are COVID safe communities online, and scientists and medical professionals who are every day talking about different ways to keep one safe, right? So for example, I just followed my wife to a conference recently, and we stayed in an Airbnb, and we we have 4 HEPA like big HEPA filters in our house. Like we at all times going, basically, even though we live in a house, so like there's no one else coming in, but like just for our own comfort, we bought them when we were living in a duplex, and so they were another family. But we bring at least one with us to any hotel or Airbnb that we stay in, because the science shows that HEPA filtration, right, increasing filtration and air circulation in a space drastically reduces the chances of COVID infection. And so as a manager or as an administration or even as a worker, right, getting together and saying, how can we, if the university will not pay for this, how can we come together and figure out a way to increase the filtration within the library, right? Having big like HEPA filters at the desk, at the reference desk, at the access services desk, at the ILL desk, making sure that we are all masking, even if the patrons won't, right? These are some ways that even if you have to come in every day, that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to stay COVID unsafe every day. So that would be what I would do.
Okay, our next most upvoted question, how would you suggest balancing being ambitious and wanting to make that radical change without falling into overworking and vocational awe?
Yeah, this is definitely something that I've dealt with personally. I'm definitely an overachiever. I definitely have perfectionist tendencies. And so it can really be hard. Like, I do want to acknowledge that it can be really hard not to want to go above and beyond, not because of any external pressure, but because of internal pressure, right? And so what I try and remember is that librarianship is a career, right? This is a marathon, not a sprint. And so going so hard in those first 5 years and then burning out for the next 10, right? That's not what we want to be going for, right? And so just trying to keep that in mind, that this is hopefully a field you want to be in for 20, 25, 30 years, right? And so how can you sustain that growth over time? How can you, when like there will always be amazing opportunities that come around. And so reminding yourself of that, like you can say no to this thing. There will be something that will come up next year and the year after that and the year after that. Like there will always be conferences, right? We're a very conference heavy field, right? And so you don't have to speak at every single conference, right? If you're on the tenure track and that's what you're worried about, talking to those who have already gone through the tenure process and seeing like what is actually in the packet, right? If it says you need 3 publications, then, like focus on doing 3 good publications. You don't have to do 3 publications and 5 conferences and being on 6 committees and, like see what's actually required for tenure, right? In the same way that you are trying not to deal with job creep, right? It's to actually look at what is required, try and hit those marks, and understand that again, that there will be plenty of time to do amazing work, and that certain awards such as, movers and shakers does not necessarily guarantee tenure, right? And so in many ways, focusing on just being a good librarian, like in whatever way that means, or being a good library worker in whatever way that means, will help you in the long run.
Thank you so much for that kind of refocusing around personal sustainability and what you can do over the long term. It's 1:27. I'm going to do one last shorter question, if that's all right with you. How do we get people outside of the library to not think of librarians and libraries with this awe, or the idea that we are the holder of democracy? Big question.
Yeah. I don't know if you necessarily can, and I know that's not like a great answer, but it's true. We can only react in the ways we personally are going to react. We can model good behavior. We can make sure that our narratives are helping to include the labor of the workers that we're doing, right? But we can't necessarily force people to think a certain way. What I would say is that depending on the circumstance, just try and always mention the labor that's involved in doing all of the work that we do. So again, not conflating the library as building with library as worker, right? Because that's a big thing. Always saying, always praising how much work it takes to run a library and to make all these amazing programs, to have all these initiatives go. When it comes to proving our value, right? Not falling into that trap of trying to be everything for everyone. Having sort of gentle corrections when vocational awe comes up in the room, right? Saying yeah, no, libraries and library workers, we do amazing work. I just wish that we were paid more or something like that, things that actually bring up the fact that we're not magicians, we don't just wave a wand and suddenly we have an amazing collection, right? Or that we are doing this solely for the love of community and our work and whatever it might be. And just modeling that narrative, right? Deconstructing those myths and assumptions about librarianship that vocational awe brings every time it comes up when you can.
Thank you so much. That's a really wonderful note to end on, a reminder to recognize the people who do the work of libraries. Thank you so much, Fobazi, for your wonderful keynote, for sharing your thoughts and experience and ideas with us today. I hope everyone enjoys the afternoon sessions. And yeah, let's give another last round of applause for Fobazi. Thank you all.
Thank you all so much. Again, if I didn't get to your question,